43 days until the statute of limitations expires. 43 days to file a federal lawsuit challenging a land seizure that happened before you were born. 43 days to prove that a city government took 100 acres from your grandmother, claimed they paid for it, and somehow lost every single document. That would prove their claim. 43 days to honor a woman who spent 30 years saying they stole our land, while everyone smiled politely and changed the subject. Because you cannot fight City Hall, dead cases stay dead. And sometimes you just have to accept that justice does not always win. Except Felicia Grant was 29 years old and worked as a paralegal and knew exactly how much documentation mattered in court. Knew that original deeds trump missing records. Knew that tax receipts prove ownership. Knew that the Fifth Amendment says the government cannot take private property without just compensation. And if they cannot prove they paid, they still owe. 43 days were enough time. Barely, if she worked fast. If the attorney she found believed her. If the documents her grandmother had kept for 40 years were enough to make a federal judge listen. Some deadlines are arbitrary. This one was justice with an expiration. Felicia Grant was 29 years old and had spent her entire career preparing for a case she did not know she would fight. She worked as a paralegal at a civil rights law firm. Started as a receptionist 6 years ago, worked her way into legal assistant roles, learned document management, case research, and filing procedures. Earned her paralegal certification through night classes while working full-time. Her specialty was property disputes, land title issues, eminent domain challenges, the intersection of historical injustice and current legal remedies. She had assisted on 17 cases where black families fought to recover property taken through various means: tax sales, forced auctions, eminent domain seizures, and fraudulent transfers. She knew the patterns, knew how property got stolen legally, knew how documentation could prove ownership decades later, knew which courts had jurisdiction, knew what evidence mattered. Her grandmother, Loretta Grant, had owned 100 acres of farmland outside the city. Inherited it from her parents in 1962. Clear title, proper deed. Paid property taxes every year without fail. In 1984, the State Highway Department decided to build Interstate 530's extension. The route they chose cut directly through Loretta's property. Severed it down the middle. Made farming impossible. Made the land worthless except as right-of-way for a highway. Loretta claimed the city took the land without paying. The city claimed they had paid fair market value, but the records were lost in a 1990s office relocation. Loretta kept telling the story. Kept saying they stole her land. Kept waiting for someone to believe her. Nobody did. Until Felicia found the documents. Loretta died 3 months ago at 87 years old. Felicia found the documents while clearing out her grandmother's house. A metal lockbox in the back of a closet. Inside, the original property deed from 1962, handwritten in the beautiful cursive people used before computers. Tax receipts from 1962 through 1999. Letters from the Highway Department dated 1983, 1984, discussing necessary land, acquisition, and fair compensation. Pending final appraisal, and one letter dated March 15, 1985, from the city. Per our discussion, final payment for property acquisition will be processed within 60 days following completion of environmental review. No follow-up letters. No payment records. No documentation shows the city ever followed through. Felicia spent 2 days reading every document, making copies, organizing chronologically, building a timeline that showed clear ownership, consistent tax payment, and communication about compensation that apparently never materialized. She took the documents to her boss, an attorney named Theodore Hopkins, who specialized in civil rights and property cases. "This is incredible documentation," Theodore said, reviewing the papers carefully. "Your grandmother kept perfect records, deed, taxes. The city's own correspondents acknowledged they were taking the property. Can we sue?" Felicia asked. "The taking was in 1985, Theodore said, 40 years ago. The statute of limitations is typically 3 to 6 years for property claims." Felicia's heart sank. "But," Theodore continued, "there is an exception. If the government committed fraud by claiming they paid when they did not, and if your grandmother did not discover the fraud until recently, the statute of limitations does not start until discovery. That is called the discovery rule. She always knew they did not pay her," Felicia said. "She told anyone who would listen. But did she have proof they were lying?" Theodore asked. Or just her word against theirs? Felicia thought about that. She had these letters. They promised payment, but maybe she assumed it was her word against the city's records until now. These letters are dated 1985, Theodore said. If she kept them but never filed suit, we need to argue she lacked access to legal resources or understanding to pursue federal claims. Or we argue continuing violation because the highway still sits on her land, taken without compensation. Can you file the case? Felicia asked. Theodore was quiet. This will be expensive. Discovery. Expert witnesses to establish the property value in 1985 and calculate compound interest. City will fight hard because admitting they took land without paying opens them to other claims. This could take 3 to 5 years. I know, Felicia said. I work property cases. I know what we are facing. Your grandmother passed away, Theodore said gently. You are not the original owner. Standing might be an issue. I am the heir, Felicia said. The land was never legally transferred to the city. It passed to my mother when my grandmother died. My mother assigned her interest to me 3 weeks ago to pursue this claim. I have documentation, Theodore smiled. You have been doing your homework. I am a paralegal, Felicia said. This is what I do. Can you file or not? Have you ever discovered documents that prove something your family always said but nobody believed? Comment below if you have found evidence that changed everything about a story you were told growing up. Theodore filed the federal lawsuit 6 weeks later. The complaint was detailed. 40 pages. Alleged unconstitutional taking without just compensation. Violation of the Fifth Amendment. Fraud by claiming payment without documentation. Continuing trespass by using land never legally acquired. Demanded fair market value from 1985, 40 years of compound interest, attorney fees, and court costs. The city's response was immediate and aggressive. Denied all claims. Argued that the statute of limitations barred the suit. Claimed they had paid Loretta in full, but records were destroyed in accordance with document retention policies. Moved to dismiss for failure to state a claim. Federal Judge Patricia Morrison denied the motion to dismiss. Plaintiff has presented sufficient evidence, including defendant's own correspondence acknowledging taking and promising payment. If the defendant claims payment was made, the defendant bears the burden of proving it. Case proceeds to discovery. Discovery was brutal. The city produced exactly 0 documents showing payment. No checks, no receipts. No accounting records. No correspondence confirming that Loretta received money. Our records from that period were destroyed per standard 7-year retention policy, the city attorney argued. We cannot produce documents that no longer exist. You retained correspondence from 1985 discussing the taking, Theodore countered. You retained property files. You retained engineering documents, but you destroyed all payment records? That is convenient. Where are you watching from? Have you ever watched someone claim they have no proof of something they definitely did? Drop a comment about dealing with missing records that benefit the party that should have kept them. The city offered a settlement. $200,000. Take it or leave it. More than you will get at trial. No, Felicia said immediately. The land was worth a minimum $5,000 per acre in 1985. That is $500,000. With 40 years of compound interest at the statutory rate, that is over $1.5 million, plus attorney fees. We are not settling for $200,000, Theodore agreed. They are panicking. They have no documents. They know they are going to lose. We go to trial. The trial was scheduled 18 months after filing. The city made 3 more settlement offers, each higher than the last. Felicia rejected all of them. My grandmother spent 30 years being told she was wrong, Felicia said. That she must have been paid and forgotten. That she was confused. That the city would never steal land. I am not settling until they admit what they did. The trial lasted 4 days. Felicia testified first. Explained finding the documents. Explained her grandmother's story. Explained why this mattered beyond money. My grandmother told me about this land since I was a child, Felicia said. She described where the house had stood, where they grew crops, where the property line ran. She showed me tax receipts proving she owned it. She told me the city took it and never paid, and everyone told her she must be mistaken, that the government does not do things like that, that she must have received payment and forgotten. But she did not forget, Felicia continued. She kept every document, waited for someone to believe her, died still waiting. I am here because someone needs to say she was right. She was telling the truth. They did take her land. They did not pay. And that theft does not become legal just because 40 years have passed. The city's defense was weak. They had no payment records. No witnesses remembered the transaction. just assertions that surely they must have paid because that is the procedure. We follow legal requirements, the city attorney argued. Eminent domain requires just compensation. We would not have violated the law. Then show the payment records, Theodore said during cross-examination of the city's records manager. Show us the check. Show us the accounting entry. Show us anything proving money changed hands. I cannot, the records manager admitted. Those documents were destroyed. How convenient, Theodore said. You destroyed the only evidence that would prove you followed the law. 40 years later, my client still has her grandmother's deed and tax receipts. But you destroyed records, showing you paid? Does that seem reasonable? The jury deliberated for 6 hours, returned with a verdict for Felicia on all claims, found the city had taken property without compensation, awarded a fair market value of $500,000 in 1985, awarded compound interest of $180,000, awarded attorney fees of $280,000, total judgment, $1,160,000. Have you ever watched someone finally get justice after decades of being called a liar? Share below. If you have seen vindication come so late, it felt bittersweet because the person who deserved it most was not there to see it. The city appealed immediately, argued that the award was excessive, argued that the interest calculation was wrong, argued Loretta should have filed suit in the 1980s instead of waiting. The appeals court was not sympathetic. Defendant city failed to produce any evidence of payment despite bearing the burden of proof. Plaintiff presented the original deed, continuous tax payments, and the defendant's own correspondence acknowledging the taking and promising compensation. The trial court's findings are supported by substantial evidence. Interest calculation is appropriate given the 40-year delay caused by the defendant's failure to maintain records. Judgment affirmed. The city had 30 days to appeal to a higher court or pay the judgment. They chose payment. $1,960,000 transferred to Felicia's account 63 days after the verdict. Felicia sat in her apartment staring at her bank balance. Nearly $2 million. Life-changing money. The money her grandmother should have received 40 years ago. Money that would have sent Felicia's mother to college. Money that would have changed 3 generations of her family's trajectory. But also vindication. Proof that her grandmother was not confused, not mistaken, not lying. Proof that documentation matters. Proof that keeping receipts for 40 years was not paranoia but wisdom. Proof that sometimes justice takes decades, but arrives eventually if someone refuses to stop fighting. Felicia drove to the cemetery, sat by her grandmother's grave, told her about the verdict, about the appeals court affirming, about the city finally admitting through payment what they would never admit in words, that they had taken land without paying and lied about it for 40 years. You were right, Grandma, Felicia said. They did steal your land, and now they paid for it. I am sorry it took so long. I am sorry you did not live to see it, but I made sure everyone knew you were telling the truth. Felicia did not keep the money for herself alone. She used $500,000 to establish the Loretta Grant Property Rights Legal Fund, a nonprofit that provided free legal representation to families fighting property disputes, particularly cases involving historical takings from black landowners. There are hundreds of families with stories like my grandmother's, Felicia told the board she assembled. Families who lost land to eminent domain, tax sales, fraudulent transfers, or outright theft. Families who were told they had no proof, no recourse, no hope of recovery. We are going to help them find their documents, file their cases, and recover what was stolen. She used $400,000 to purchase land, 40 acres outside the city. Not the original family property. That was still a highway. But land that could be passed down. Land that could never be taken because it was titled in a trust with 3 generations of succession specified. Land that honored what her grandmother lost by ensuring future generations would not. She used $200,000 to establish scholarships for black students pursuing law, paralegal studies, or property management, for students who wanted to learn how to protect what their families built, for students who understood that legal knowledge was power and documentation was protection. She used $150,000 to fund a documentary about her grandmother's case, about historical land theft from black families across the region, about the ongoing fight for property justice, about why keeping records matters, about how legal systems that once sanctioned theft could be forced to provide remedies if you had evidence and refused to stop fighting. The remaining $10,000 she split between her mother, her aunt, and herself. Inheritance that should have come from that 100 acres in 1985. Late, but real. Compensation for 40 years of being told your mother was wrong when she was right. Felicia kept her job as a paralegal. She liked the work, liked helping attorneys build cases, liked organizing documents, researching precedents, and finding the evidence that made justice possible. But now she also ran the legal fund, reviewed cases, connected families with attorneys, helped people find their grandparents' deeds in storage boxes and county archives, helped turn old papers into current lawsuits. She had found her calling, not by planning, by needing justice for her grandmother and discovering that hundreds of other families needed the same thing. 3 years after the verdict, Felicia had helped. 12 families file federal claims for property taken without compensation. 4 cases settled. 3 were still in discovery. 5 were awaiting trial. Total recovered, $6.7 million. Property returned to families who thought it was lost forever. The city changed its document retention policies, property records, payment. Documentation and eminent domain files are now retained permanently to prevent future disputes and ensure transparency, the city council resolution stated. They did not admit wrongdoing, but they changed the policy that had allowed them to destroy evidence. Felicia spoke at law schools, at paralegal programs, at community centers in black neighborhoods where families gathered to hear about property rights and how to protect them. Your ancestors were not careless, she told audiences. They kept deeds, they paid taxes, they followed the law, and often, their property was taken anyway through legal mechanisms designed to transfer wealth from black families to white institutions. That theft was legal then, but legal and just are not the same thing, and you can challenge historical injustice if you have documentation. She taught people what documents to keep: original deeds, every tax receipt, every letter from government agencies, every communication about property, everything, forever. My grandmother kept 40 years of receipts, Felicia said. Everyone told her she was hoarding paper, that she should let go, that she was being paranoid. But those receipts proved she paid taxes on land the city claimed it owned. Those receipts were evidence. That paranoia was wisdom. If this story resonates with you, share it with someone who owns property and might not know how to protect it. Tell me in the comments. Do you have family stories about lost land or property that was taken? Have you ever looked for the documents that might prove it? Here is what Felicia's story teaches us. First, documentation is generational protection. Loretta kept papers for 40 years, died before she could use them. But those documents became her granddaughter's weapon. If you own property, keep perfect records, not just for yourself, for the descendants who might need to prove what you built and protected. Deeds, tax receipts, every letter, every communication, forever. Second, government power requires documentation too. The city claimed they paid. The judge said, prove it. They could not. The government must document what it does, especially when taking private property. If they cannot prove payment, they still owe. Fifth Amendment protection is meaningless without the ability to enforce it through evidence. Third, the statute of limitations is complex, not absolute. This happened in 1985. Lawsuit filed in 2024. 39 years later, city argued too late. The court disagreed because the city had committed fraud by claiming payment without proof. If someone defrauded you, the limitations clock might not start until you discover the fraud. Consult attorneys about specific situations, but too late is not always the final answer. Fourth, knowing legal procedure matters as much as being right. Felicia was right about the facts, but she needed legal knowledge to file properly, survive motions to dismiss, navigate discovery, and present evidence correctly. Being right is not enough. You need to know how to prove you are right within legal systems. Legal education, formal or self-taught, is power. Fifth, younger generations can finish fights that elders started. Loretta could not pursue this case. Too old, too tired, too overwhelmed by systems designed to exhaust challengers. But she kept the documents. told the story, passed the knowledge. Felicia had youth, energy, legal training, and her grandmother's evidence. Generational justice is real. What you cannot finish, your children might. Sixth, vindication matters beyond money. The $196 million mattered, changed lives, but vindication mattered more. Proving Loretta was not confused, not mistaken, not lying, restoring reputation, forcing acknowledgement. That is justice that money measures but does not fully capture. Fight for both. Finally, systemic injustice requires systemic response. Felicia could have taken her settlement and disappeared. Instead, she built a legal fund, bought land, funded scholarships, and created a documentary. One family's justice became infrastructure for others. If you win against a system, use that win to help others still trapped. That is how individual victories become collective progress. If your family has lost property through eminent domain, tax sales, forced auctions, fraudulent transfers, look for documents. Old deeds, tax receipts, letters, legal notices, check courthouse records, county archives, storage boxes in relatives' attics. Evidence might exist proving what you always suspected. And if you find it, consult attorneys who specialize in historical property claims. Limitation periods are complex. Some cases that seem dead might be viable with the right evidence and legal strategy. Sometimes land theft becomes legal through time and missing records. Sometimes a grandmother keeps receipts for 40 years waiting for someone to believe her. And sometimes a granddaughter with a paralegal certification and her grandmother's lockbox makes a city pay for stealing what they claimed they bought.